Great. Thank you very much, Jim. And thanks everyone for joining us here today. I know everyone has a busy schedule. Some of you might have joined us just 2 days ago. So thanks for making that additional room. So today we're going to talk about switch assessment. It's a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I spend a lot of time trying to help clients find a means of accessing their assistive technology. And for some of our more complex clients, switch access may be the only way they're able to access that technology right now, whether it be a communication device, a power wheelchair, some simple control of tablets or adaptive toys, etc. Today, we're going to focus, however, on people with muscle weakness. Now, I know a lot of you work in pediatrics. I do as well. This information is going to apply to pediatrics and adults, but we see different types of muscle weakness in each population, and we'll quickly review that as well. So my name is Michelle. I'm an occupational therapist in the Denver, Colorado area. I've been working with assistive tech for a long time now. Actually, it's been, I think, 35 years this year. And I love what I do. I get to work with clients some of the time, and then I also do some consultation and education, including education for Ablenet. Well, let's get this slide advanced here. There we go. So today we're going to cover some general assessment considerations when we're working with someone who has muscle weakness, switch types and switch placements that are common with this population, and then wrap it up with a case study. Feel free to type any questions or comments you have as we go along in that Q&A box. If you're like me, by the time questions come along, I've forgotten what I want to ask. So if I don't answer it right away, I definitely will do so, but go ahead and put them in whenever you would like. So let's start with assessment considerations. So just how does muscle weakness impact someone's ability to access their technology? Well, active range of motion, my ability to reach out, is going to be limited. The distance I can reach may be limited as well. That means we need to bring something in closer to a client to accommodate that in most cases. Activation force probably will be limited as well. So we have to look for a switch that requires less force or perhaps no force, and that includes our electronic switches. And endurance is most likely limited as well. So even if during an assessment, let's say the client can reach out and actively push something and activate that switch, they may not be able to do so for long periods of time. So it's important with this population to make sure that the person can repeatedly hit the switch throughout their day. For a communication device user, for example, that could involve hundreds of switch hits. So does the person have adequate range, adequate force, but also endurance at that location and with that switch? And if someone's using a power wheelchair, sustained switch activation is required. So the client has to activate, hold down that switch for the period of time the chair is in motion. And again, that requires a certain amount of strength and endurance. Now, in our pediatric population, the clients that we see who have muscle weakness are going to include children with spinal muscular atrophy, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Hi, Werner. Thank you for joining us from Austria. Appreciate that. Hope everything's going well in your neck of the woods. So spinal muscular atrophy, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, congenital myopathies, and other dystrophies. In the adult population, we can see muscle weakness, particularly in people with ALS, but there's other dystrophies where we can see muscle weakness in the adult population as well. Some of these pediatric diagnoses, like people with spinal muscular atrophy or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, we see people who are now adults with those diagnoses. Because of medical advances, we see people with some of these conditions living a much, much longer lifespan than before, and who have ongoing and changing access needs as their conditions progress. So in that assessment, we need to determine where the client has movement. We then need to determine as best as we can, this is tricky, how likely that movement will persist or be spared. Now, I see a lot of clients who have a diagnosis where I've never worked with someone with that diagnosis before. Because of medical advances, we have more and more specific diagnoses than we have. And I've been doing this for a long time. So it's unusual that I keep seeing so many clients with these new diagnoses. That means that it's very difficult to guess, to predict what movement may be spared in someone who has an exceedingly rare condition. But sometimes, depending on a diagnosis, there are certain movements that tend to persist or are spared over time. And those might be movements that we are going to look at. We need to determine how much force this client's movement has, and then determine that endurance for repeatability and sustained contact with the switch. Now, I really do want this to be helpful to you and to the clients that you're working with. So think about a client you're working with. And then as we move through this, think about where you might try to put a switch and what type of switch to try. And then after this course, when you see them, give it a try. See if it works. Feel free to email me. Let me know how it went. Now, we have some other courses in the Ablenet library about switch assessment that go into more detail about where to place a switch and what type of switch to use. Our focus again today is on muscle weakness. But just to review, an ideal switch site. This is ideal. We can't always reach to ideal, but we move towards ideal. We want as small a movement as possible. We want an isolated movement. This means this client isn't pulling in reflexive responses or the patterns of movement. We want a volitional movement. That means it's really truly under my voluntary control. Some of our clients have a lot of movement, but it isn't under good volitional control. We want controlled activation. I can reach out and activate that switch with sustained pressure if required and controlled release. So let's take a closer look. We do have a question here. Laura has asked for a power wheelchair. Can you use something like a switch latch and timer so the user does not have to use sustained force? We wouldn't use a switch latch and timer with a power wheelchair, but on power wheelchair programming, there is a feature called latch, and usually we latch forward, occasionally reverse. So the client activates a switch, the chair is going to keep moving forward until it receives another command, which is typically reverse, and that stops the movement of the chair. The challenge with latch is that if the client is distracted or is going to have difficulty reaching the switch again, they can't stop themselves. The chair is going to keep moving. Latch is primarily used with people who use sip and puff, because to move forward, you have to exert a certain amount of air pressure within your mouth, and it's very difficult to sustain that for a long distance, like I'm going all the way down a long hallway or down a sidewalk. So instead, you give one hard puff, activate latch, and keep going until you give a sip, which will then stop movement of the chair. So there is latch available through the programming of power wheelchairs. I do not use this very often. There may be times with someone with muscle weakness where we want to use this so that sustained pressure is not required, but very important to make sure the client can consistently stop that chair. Hope that helps. All right, so let's review again quickly these characteristics of an ideal switch site. Small movement. We want as small a movement as possible. Some of our clients use a huge movement to activate their switch. Usually someone with muscle weakness is going to use a small movement because that's really all they're able to exert. This movement, however, may only be possible if the area is well supported. So this young man here is using his thumb to activate a fiber optic switch. This is an electronic switch that doesn't require any force, and it's mounted through the arm pad, the hand pad of his arm trough. But in order for him to wiggle his thumb just a very small amount. To activate this switch, he needs good postural support. So he has this full arm trough supporting his arm and the hand pad supporting his hand. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to use this switch. Again, we want this isolated movement. Now, people with muscle weakness don't usually display patterns of movement and primitive reflexes that we see in other populations, like people with cerebral palsy. And we don't usually see overflow. In some of our clients, when they're trying to move in one area of their body, sometimes we see movement somewhere else. The body's trying to help that movement along. This is something we don't usually see in people with muscle weakness. I mentioned before a volitional movement. This is a client demonstrating a very small movement that we ended up capturing with fiber optics. Again, this is not usually a problem for people with muscle weakness because non-volitional extraneous movements like athetosis and dystonia aren't common in this population. But what about activation? Well, we want to reduce the amount of travel that's required for someone to activate their switch. We want to use that small movement. We want to reduce activation pressure, both for the ability to activate the switch at all, but also for repeated or sustained activations. We can even choose a switch that requires no pressure at all. Speed, my ability to activate that switch quickly, could be impacted by muscle weakness. So this is important to keep in mind if someone is scanning or needs to get to a switch quickly for other activities. And accuracy, and this is greatly tied into speed, may also be impacted because this person may not be able to respond quite as quickly as they would like to. Other reasons why we need to really cut down that activation travel and force to help compensate for speed and accuracy. Sustained pressure. So again, sustained pressure is required in power mobility. Even if we use latch for forward, for example, we still need some sustained contact to make a turn. So that can lead to fatigue in people with muscle weakness, and it's important that we address that. Again, reducing the amount of force and travel. Jamie has said, I would love to have more information about fiber optic switches and no pressure switches. Hang on, because we're going to get to that. Controlled release is important whenever someone's using a switch, but is particularly important for people who are using a power wheelchair, because that's how we stop and not crash into something. So this person needs to be able to time their ability to release a switch to stop. They need to be able to do so consistently. And one thing that's sometimes seen in people with muscle weakness is they tend to stabilize against a switch. And so release can be difficult as a result. This young man here has a Microlight switch that's mounted by the inside of his right knee, his medial knee, and he uses this for one of his turns. He's able to release this fairly readily. But sometimes we might place a switch where somebody perhaps leans against it with their hand and leans into it, and suddenly letting go is hard because I'm using that contact to partially maintain my postural control. So with someone who has muscle weakness, it's important to make sure they have adequate support within their seating system so they can really differentiate that movement from the rest of their body. They can free up that movement and not have difficulty with release. So if you're working with someone with muscle weakness, they have difficulty with release, know that it might be related to their positioning. They might need more support. All right, let's take a moment here for some questions. Jennifer has said, what mount is used for this switch? So this mount here on controlled release, thank you, Jennifer, is actually called a Gatlin mount, and it's made by a number of companies. This one here might be made from Stealth Products, and it's mounted underneath the arm pad. It's often used to mount a joystick when we don't want it at the end of the arm pad, where we need it closer in, but this happened to work to hold it where we mounted this particular switch. We then just took a simple L bracket and attached it to the Gatlin mount to support the Microlight with some Velcro. This allows us to swing it out of the way for transfers, because otherwise this would obviously be a problem. Hey, Brittany, how you doing? Brittany has said, hi, Michelle. You'll go through the switches you were referring to in these slides, right? Yes, I will. Absolutely. Okay. See if there's any other questions or comments before we move forward. For those of you in the certain areas of our country yesterday, I hope you weren't blown away. It was a very windy day for a lot of us. We were fine here, though our basketball pole ended up in the driveway. That's okay. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions or comments now, but if you're typing, feel free to continue to do so, and I will pick those up. So we're going to move into some of these switch types, again with a focus on switch types that are commonly used in people who have muscle weakness. So again, we're trying to reduce the activation range and force. So we have two main categories of switch types, mechanical and electrical. Mechanical do require travel to reach the switch, even if it's fairly close to the client, and do require some activation force. Some require less than others. Electrical switches do not require any pressure, but they do require a power source. Travel is often required, though it might be quite small. There's also less feedback. So if my client presses this jelly bean switch, this mechanical switch here, it's going to provide a nice crisp click. But if they activate that fiber optic switch that's also pictured on this page, there's going to be no noise or a very, very subtle, quiet noise that's sometimes hard to hear. So it's just important to keep in mind, some of our clients really do benefit from feedback. I'm a big fan of that. But with these electrical switches, it's important that the client has a chance to practice and understand, yes, you have activated the switch, even though perhaps you're not even touching it. So we don't have the same tactile feedback. We just have to approach the switch. And we may not have the auditory feedback. So let's start with mechanical switches. We have plate switches and light touch plate switches. Again, there's lots and lots of switches on the market. We're certainly not going to go through all of them, but these are examples of switches that work well for people with muscle weakness. What's usually not appropriate for people with muscle weakness are large plate switches. It's just too big an area. We need a really small movement here. Lever switches and pneumatic switches like those sip and puff. Most people with muscle weakness cannot use sip and puff because of weakness of the muscles in that from the lips to the mouth. The ability to control air pressure with something like sip and puff is impaired in someone who has ALS, for example. But these plate and light touch plate switches can be helpful. So let's start with Ablenet. Ablenet has the jelly bean and spec switches, and I've put Michelle's toolbox here because these are switches I use a tremendous amount, especially in evaluation. So even if I decided perhaps this person needs a different switch for a final selection, it's a great place to start. For an evaluation, these are a great size to try in numerous locations. They also have that nice auditory and tactile feedback. Ablenet also has the buddy switch. This is old Tash switch. It requires just a little bit more pressure than the jelly bean. And so you might find that you use jelly bean more frequently with someone who has muscle weakness. Adaptivation Origin also has something called the Orbi switch. It's similar in size to the jelly bean. And Enabling Devices has the Gumball, which is similar to the jelly bean in size, the mini Gumball, and the compact, both of which are similar in size to the specs switch. A newer switch that's available on the market is from a company called Movis, and Movis is out of Belgium, and it's distributed in the United States by Stealth Products, and it's called the Twister switch. Originally, this was only available in combination with some power wheelchair driving methods, but they did come out with some separate switches. This is quite small, maybe half the size in the activation area of a spec switch, and very sensitive. And they do have these new dome-shaped bases so that you can Velcro place this somewhere for a client. So you could use all 5 of these at once for power mobility, for example, or just a single switch. Another switch that is in my toolbox that I use a lot, especially with people with muscle weakness, is the Microlight switch. This is available through several manufacturers, but also through Ablenet. That silver rectangle that you see on the surface of the switch can be replaced with other colors. And that can be nice, first, just to give the client a choice of colors. I perhaps like a different color instead of this silver color. But also, if someone's using more than one switch and perhaps they're right next to each other, it might help the client as well as other team members around that client to recognize what the function of each switch is. So you can use different colors to help everyone realize that these switches have different functions. ASL, Adaptive Switch Labs, a few years back now, has come up with something similar called the ultralight switch. It's very light touch, and you can also change the color of a sticker on the top of this. It has 2 little tap holes in the bottom for mounting. The Microlight does have 1 tap hole as well, or you could use Velcro. What's nice about this ultralight switch is it's tapered so that I don't have to lift my finger as high to activate it. However, it's not quite as sensitive as the Microlight, even though it's a very sensitive switch. And so I really like the ultralight, but I find myself with people with muscle weakness using the Microlight a little more often just because of that increased sensitivity. Another light touch plate switch is from RJ Cooper. It's called the Air Touch Switch, and you can see it's available here on a strap. You can put it in someone's palm and they can squeeze it. This strap base is also available on the Ablenet spec switch. Then we move into light touch plate switches. Now, these are sometimes not more sensitive necessarily than some of the other plate switches, but they are designed specifically to be very light touch. Some of these are also less durable, so it's important to keep that in mind. So Ablenet has the Ablenet plate switch. This is a redesign of an older Tash switch and is more durable than that older option, which is nice, very sensitive on its surface, and a very low profile switch, so someone doesn't have to lift up and over the edge very far. Adaptivation also has the PAL pads, and those are pictured in the middle here. They come in different sizes, also very low profile switch. And then AMDI has their moon switch, a little higher to get up and over the edge of this, but very sensitive. Enabling Devices has this mini saucer. They also have a larger saucer, but that's harder size-wise for people with muscle weakness. It has a flying saucer sort of shape, so someone can go ahead and activate it on the edges where it's lower profile. It's designed to be very light touch. So before we get into electronic or electrical switches, we have a couple questions here. Aaron has said, are there any switches that have a louder feedback for hearing impaired people? So if someone's having difficulty hearing the switch, either because the click just isn't there, like an electronic switch, or it's not within someone's hearing ability and they really need that feedback, you have a couple options. First, you can spend some time just helping the person get used to the switch. They can feel the switch, perhaps they can see the switch depending on where it's mounted, and they can see the effect of the switch. Like I'm moving my power chair, or I'm now seeing my scan on my communication device, or I've heard my selection from my communication device. So there's other feedback that's available that might help this person compensate for lack of auditory feedback. Another option is you could plug that switch into a splitter cable. One cable will go to the assistive technology device, like a communication device. The other cable can go into something that beeps, and you can sometimes use a switch tester. And I believe Ablenet still has some switch testers that light up or beep. And that way the person can perhaps hear that sound. It'll probably drive them nuts after a while, but it might help them get over that little bit of a learning curve. Some communication devices also have some auditory feedback options where when you hit that switch and the scan starts, you might hear a noise. I'm not sure how much you can turn the volume up on that feedback on each communication device, but that might also be helpful. And Margaret has said, I have an adult client with MSA, not SMA. Okay. He will have progressive loss of all motor control. Would you recommend a fiber optic switch as his disease progresses? So when we're dealing with someone, again, we have this wide variety of diagnoses we might run into. I'm going to write that down, look it up, MSA. It's important to get back to assessment. Oh, it's a form of Parkinson's. Thank you. It's important to get back to that assessment, regardless of the diagnosis, and determine where does this person have movement, what's their active travel range and force. And then as best as you can determine which of those movements are most likely to persist and put those switches there. As the client continues to progress, you will undoubtedly need to change the position and or type of switch. And we'll see that in a case study coming up, but it's certainly not uncommon that we need to continue to follow these clients and change as they change. So eventually this client may need fiber optics. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so, oh, sorry, we have one more. Are there any switches that can be activated through eye gaze? Oh, and I have another question before that. There is a, yes, well, no, sorry. There's not one that I'm aware of that can be activated by eye gaze. Of course, you can activate some devices by eye gaze. There is a switch that can be activated by an eye blink. The only one that's still on the market is from Enabling Devices. They have an eye blink device. So it is often worn on a pair of glasses. There's a switch that's looking towards the eyelids, and as the person intentionally blinks, it will capture that. So yes, and I'm not sure, I don't think I have that in there because it's actually a mechanical switch, so I should. So thank you for bringing that up. It's an eye blink switch. And another question here. There we go. Sorry, I missed a few of these questions in the chat box. Do you know if any companies allow you to trial any of their switches? We have some lending libraries in our area. They don't always have all the options. You might need to trial. Switches can be costly, etc. So agreed. Some manufacturers do allow you to borrow switches to see if they work for a client. Or like you said, you could take advantage of some of those lending libraries. One thing I've certainly done over the years is if somebody is no longer using a certain type of switch and they're willing to donate it to our clinic, we will take it. And we use those switches for loaner switches, for evaluation switches all the time. But yes, you can often get loans. It depends on the manufacturer. And then Lorna has said, do you know of any switches like this that would allow for vibration for the student to feel that they have hit the switch? The switch would be used on the foot and out of sight. So Enabling Devices actually has a lot of switches that vibrate when you touch them. But most of those switches are large switches that have a higher activation force requirement. And so those are not generally appropriate for someone with muscle weakness. Again, I would recommend what I suggested for someone with hearing impairments is that you look to build that consistency for someone so they know that's where the switch is, even though it's out of sight and even though I may not feel it. I work with a fair amount of clients who have used a switch by a foot and usually learn where it is, just like you and I kind of learn where that gas pedal is in our car, even though we've got a foot that's covered with a sock and a shoe, we still have some tactile feedback. Even though it's out of sight, we know where it is. To develop consistency in switch activation, we need to give a client an opportunity to hit that switch hundreds of times to develop that automaticity. So I hope that helps. And there we go. Great. Thank you. And someone asks, can you get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. You'll get a link to a handout of these. And Alana, I'm going to grab your question in our next time for questions. All right, so let's get to electronic switches so we can get through these as well. We're going to start with proximity switches. And some of the available ones out there that run on an incorporated battery are the Honeybee from Adaptivation and the Ablenet Candy Corn. And this comes in two different sizes, a large and a small, that you can see pictured here. Now, the small one does actually have some built-in feedback, auditory feedback. It will beep as you get close to it. The surface also lights up. So there's a little more feedback there. So let's back up and talk about proximity switches a little bit. You just have to get within proximity of the switch. You don't have to touch the surface of it at all. There's no force required, but there is power required. And again, these each have a little battery incorporated within them. These are capacitive switches. Proximity switches, in layman's terms, because I'm not an electrical engineer, measure our capacity to conduct electricity. So if I reach out to this with my bare skin, it will activate the switch, even if I don't touch it. There are adjustable switches. The candy corn is not adjustable. You'll have to get about as close as is shown in this picture. The Honeybee is adjustable. Others that are adjustable include arrays and single switches from Adaptive Switch Labs, ASL, AMDI, Stealth Products iConnect, Movis, and Switchit. Each of these have proximity switches. These all have a great deal of adjustability in terms of range, often from I'm just about on top of the switch to maybe up to a foot away. The further away you are from the switch, sometimes it can act a little fussy. So it's something to keep in mind. Generally, you're going to have someone fairly close to these switches. As each switch is adjustable, if you have these switches lined up, it's important that they're not adjusted with too large an activation range because they will set each other off. So for example, I will often use switches like this in a tray, such as the one pictured here to the left. The switches are underneath the tray, and someone can use this for driving a power wheelchair. So they slide their hand over the location of those switches. Works really well. But if the switches are programmed to be more sensitive, to have a larger activation range, and they're placed right next to each other, they're going to set each other off, and that can be a problem. So if you're using more than one of these switches, they do require a larger travel distance than fiber optics, which we'll look at here in a moment. To the right here is the head array. We have a lot of different head arrays on the market. The head array is a tri-pad headrest. There's 3 pads. And when you touch your head to the back pad, the chair moves forward. Touch your head to either side, and you turn the chair in that direction. The head array is a very common alternative driving method, and it uses proximity switches that are embedded within the pads. Now, as this is a capacitive switch, it's important to keep in mind a few limitations. Let's say I have a proximity switch mounted underneath the surface of this tray. The surface of the tray will not activate it because it's made out of a plastic material. My hand on top will. If I take my math book and put it on top of that tray, it will not activate the switch. But if my cat jumps up on the tray, it will. If I put a glass of milk on top of that tray, it will activate these switches. It's important to keep them away from moisture and to be aware of other things that can activate the switch so that your client doesn't have an unanticipated activation or response, particularly with a power wheelchair. So let's get into fiber optic switches. Fiber optic switches, like proximities, are an electronic switch that do not require any force. They do require a power source. And I should have mentioned on some of those other proximity switches, we may also see that the power source comes from a power wheelchair if someone's using those as a driving method. Otherwise, there's a battery, an external battery that comes with the switch that is usually rechargeable. So if you're using any of these on a power chair, you're golden. Power is just not an issue. If you're using this as a standalone switch, we have to address power. Really, even though some of these you can literally plug into the wall, it's important to have a battery source so the client can be mobile and use it wherever they are at. So fiber optics are available as a single switch or as an array where maybe you have 3 or 4 of these, and that's generally for power mobility. These capture very small movements, even smaller than a proximity switch, and they're very fragile. There's a cable that's attached here to the main controller, and that cable is often 2 separate cables, and those cables might be housed in a single wrapping, but a fiber optic beam of light shoots up one cable to a terminus, the end of this cable. Let me get my arrow there. And then it is reflected back by something it sees in its path, like someone's finger. And when it is reflected, the light goes back down the second cable, activates the switch. But this is very fast technology. A lot of our internet or cable is through fiber optics. It's very quick. And so it seems instantaneous to you and I, but these capture very small movements. The cables have to be well protected when they are mounted. This is not something we just hand off to someone. It has to be mounted somehow. Earlier, we saw a client that I work with where we had popped that fiber optic terminus, the end of that, through a hand pad of an arm trough, and the cables were carefully protected underneath. You can place it in some lock line, like what is pictured in the lower left. This is rarely used with people who have increased tone. This is great for people with muscle weakness, and these are available from Adaptive Switch Labs, Stealth Products, and Switch It. One of my favorites is the one from Stealth Products, the iConnect. The main reason is that it's so much easier to program the activation distance. It might seem like a little thing, but boy, programming these can be quite tedious. It just takes some time, and it's just a faster thing to do on the Stealth option. Okay, and I forgot I do have a picture of that iBlink switch, so I'm glad it's in here because this actually uses infrared and it does require a power source. So infrared is the same type of light that comes out of our remote controls. Our remote controls for our televisions and cable boxes also include some other transmission methods like radio, but infrared is a common one. So if I'm aiming at my TV and I cover the front of my remote control, it's not going to work. It can't go through my hand. So this is a safe type of light to place on a pair of glasses. It's aimed at the eyelashes, and when someone blinks, it activates the switch. It is programmable because we want to make sure that the switch isn't activated by every time I just blink my eyes. I have to use a more intentional blink to activate this. It is not appropriate for power wheelchair use because you cannot sustain that switch signal. It's only a momentary switch signal, but you can use it for other assistive technologies. The client really needs to keep their head still or it doesn't work very well. Again, used a lot by people with muscle weakness. A lot of people with ALS will maintain some ability to control their eye blink. Now, just an aside, fiber optic switches can be used to capture eye blink. However, we don't want to do so because fiber optic light can actually injure the eye. So it's important to use an appropriate eye blink switch, and really the only one that's safe around the eye is infrared. Lynn has asked, can you connect an eye blink switch to a switch latch to sustain switch contact? Again, it's really not safe with power chair to put a switch latch and timer between a switch and the power wheelchair. And that would be the time you needed to sustain contact. It would be possible again to use latch, but here's the gets a little complicated. Someone who's using an eye-blink switch probably can only use one switch. It's possible to drive a chair with one switch, but you have to use something called scanning. And it's a challenging way of driving. And if I'm in latch, I have to wait for my scan to get to a reverse command. And during that time, while I'm waiting for my scan and I blink again, I might run into something. So using this for a power chair is just not a real safe option. There is an eye gaze system for a power chair that would be a safer option that most people who could use an eye blink switch would be able to use. We then have touch switches, and we saw the Ablenet plate switch before. These also include the Adaptivation traction pads and the ABDA picture plate membrane switch. You know, when I want to activate my phone, I just have to touch it. It has a touch sensitive screen. And some of the switches that we have available use a similar technology. So these switches, if they're a true touch switch, will not work if I'm wearing gloves, for example, but they will work with bare skin or another conductive surface, similar again to our phone or to a tablet. So we've reduced activation force to just about nothing on these touch switches. The client does still have to reach out. Now, these traction pads pictured in the center are a little hard to make out if you're not familiar with them. You can see that someone's peeling a backing off of one of them. It's really like a piece of very thin plastic that's sticky. So you peel off the back and you can stick it to wherever you want. A tray surface, around a coffee mug, whatever you want to do. And when you touch it, it will activate the switch. They're very unique switches. There are a few sensor switches that are still available. A sensor is designed to pick up muscle activity. These are also not recommended for power mobility because the vibration that comes through the power wheelchair can literally activate the switch. It's also not possible generally to provide a sustained activation. So enabling devices has a sensor switch that's pictured on the top here. It's an older style sensor switch. We used to have a number of these. These are often placed, the sensor itself, by the side of the eye or above an eyebrow. And when somebody raises their eyebrows like they're surprised or grimaces their face, it will capture that muscle movement around the eye and activate the switch. It takes a lot of calibration so that the client can readily activate it with those movements. So that's how a more traditional sensor switch works. But since then, we've had some much more sophisticated but also very expensive options join the fray. And this includes the Tinkertron EMG switch, which is pictured to the right, and the Neuro Node EMG switch, which is pictured on the bottom from Control Bionics. Both of these are much more sophisticated in that they actually read, just like an EMG test, the muscle activity. And you can set up the required amount of muscle activity to activate the switch. These are fussy switches. They can be challenging for a caregiver to calibrate when placed on a client. And so I consider these personally a last resort switch. You want to use this only if nothing else will work, because they are, again, very expensive. It's important to rule out less costly options if we're getting funding for this. And also to not recommend something that requires a lot of fussing for caregivers if something else is a little more foolproof. If something's difficult to use, I have too many clients where it may not get used at all. And our goal is use. We want our client to be able to access their technology. Jackie has said, I just did trials with the NeuroNode on 2 kiddos yesterday, and it was fun to work with. That's great. That's awesome. So some exciting newer options. So enabling devices, kind of old school sensor. There used to be a number of those on the market, and then these two much newer options. We then have another technology called piezoelectric film. And this is a small piece of plastic film, looks kind of like plastic wrap that you'd use for your leftovers. And when this film is vibrated, it will activate a switch, provides a switch activation. This is also not recommended for power mobility because vibration from the chair can activate it. It's also not possible to provide a sustained switch activation. So Adaptivation has something called the table tapper, and it's pictured on the right here. And it does function as a switch latch and timer. You would not want to use this with power mobility. It's not safe, but you can use it with other technologies in this latched mode. So this is a way of providing that. You tap the table next to this box and that vibrates that piece of film inside. That's what provides this activation. Now, because a tap next to this box is required, it's not quite as sensitive. There is a sensitivity dial here you can see, but you'd have to see if this worked with someone who had a very significant muscle weakness or not. And Enabling Devices has their twitch switch, and you can see this piece of blue film that's taped to this young man's face next to his eye. And when he grimaces, when he makes a face, he's going to flex that, and that will activate this piezoelectric film, which is inside that blue cover. You can adjust the sensitivity of this as well. So it's a very unique switch, but also a rather fussy switch. It takes a lot of calibration. If I can make something else work that's more straightforward for the family and other team members, I will, because we don't want to hear that this young man hasn't been using his technology for the last 6 months because no one can figure it out. These have a battery inside, and it's important that that get changed out as well. If it does not, then it's easy for people to assume the switch is broken when it just simply doesn't have power. So getting practical. Hopefully at the beginning of this course, you were thinking about a client, and I hope you've thought about perhaps what type of switch might work for that client. And if so, then feel free to jot yourself down a note and give it a try. All right. So I'm going to see if we have any questions, then we're going to move into a few common switch placements for people who have muscle weakness. So Jennifer wants to know, what's the difference between the twitch switch and the muscle sensor switch? The muscle sensor is the more complex ones, is actually determining how much muscle activity there is, how many muscle fibers are being activated in a muscle belly at a given time. And you can set that within an activation range, where the twitch switch is looking at movement that results in a folding or vibration of that little piece of plastic. So it's two different strategies for capturing muscle movement. So you might have a grimace here that wrinkles that little piece of film that activates it. You might have a grimace that results in more muscle activity, and then you have a sensor that picks it up. So they're both capturing a similar movement. The sensor switch is going to be able to capture a more discrete or less active movement than the twitch switch. So I hope that helps. Richard has said, do you ever use these switches to help train new movements for children learning to move for the first time? That's an interesting question. I have not very often. If we're trying to entice a child to move in a certain direction or a certain distance, there's lots of ways we can do so. So if I'm working on finger isolation or reaching, we can use a lot of different types of switches connected to a enticing activity to try to encourage that movement. These are designed to capture very, very teeny movements. And so unless you're trying to develop that very small movement, they may not always be quite as effective. But some of the other switches, like a jelly bean, could be certainly used that way. Jim, if you could check, I think we had one other question that got deleted that I hadn't answered yet. If you could just check. Or I guess I can go to answered. Never mind. Let me
I
go
believe
to
it was just
answered.
a thank you, Michelle.
Okay. Then thank you. Then that's easy. I just thought there was something there and I hadn't read it yet. So good. I'm just going to go down here really fast. Okay, great. All right. So I'm a little behind, but that's okay. Let's do switch placement here. So again, some of our other courses that we've had about switch assessment that you could find at Ablenet University go into more detail about a switch site hierarchy, and you might want to check those out. We have one that's just all about determining where to put a switch, but we're going to again just focus here on people with muscle weakness. If someone's using their hand activated switch, sometimes it can help to place switches like these proximity switches underneath a tray, because now I don't need the strength to lift up and over a switch surface. I can just slide over the surface of the tray, and that requires less activation distance at times because I don't have to get up and over something, and less force. I can also capture very small movements by mounting a switch very, very close to a finger or thumb. You can see in the upper left here, we saw this picture before, we have a fiber optic switch that's mounted through a hand pad that's capturing very small thumb movement. Below that, we have a fiber optic switch that is placed within a custom arm trough we built, and this young man is pulling back slightly with his index finger. And to the right, we have a young man who's extending his finger slightly against a Microlight switch. Here on the left,
perfect, great. I like how you're moving towards
we have a young man with spinal muscular atrophy who's pulling back with his finger a little bit to activate a fiber optic.
I see Colby. I don't know where Silver went.
Silver ran away. Silver got tired of us talking about her.
Uh-huh.
Did you hear?
And it looks like you have a brother and a sister, huh?
And this young lady is extending her finger
names?
against the surface of a Microlight switch. Now, this is just on a temporary mount here on the right. We were doing an evaluation. The young man on the left, this is a custom arm trough we built for him to use in bed. He spends a great deal of time in bed with his condition. That red light that you see there is only visible really on the camera, but that's that fiber optic light. Usually we wouldn't see that. He's actually sitting in front of the switch with that finger about quarter inch, and then he pulls back slightly to activate it. Here we have examples of mounting a switch by the side of the head and trying to capture a very small movement. This young man in this video, who's adorable, does not have muscle weakness, but we can place a switch in this location to capture a very small movement, either a mechanical or an electronic switch. Other places that can be helpful for someone who has muscle weakness includes under the chin, by the side of the chin. You can use either jaw or head movement. So sometimes people who have muscle weakness may still have some movement, either opening their mouth or moving the jaw to the side, and we can capture some of that movement. Now, capture that movement can be a challenge. This is a very unique mount that's available from Adaptive Switch Labs, ASL, and it allows a fiber optic switch to be mounted through a hollow tube, and that can be aimed at the side of the head to capture maybe someone using cheek or moving their jaw to the side. Less used sites by the head that may work for someone with muscle weakness include a sensor over the eyebrow or infrared switches capturing that eye blink. Also by the mouth, some people with muscle weakness can use sip and puff, but it depends on the diagnosis. People with ALS are going to have trouble with sip and puff because the air pressure escapes from the mouth out the nose because of a problem with a soft palate, loss of competency of that. And tongue movement is usually difficult for most people who have muscle weakness, so hard to capture that as well. There we go. Sometimes people who have muscle weakness may have some discrete movement at their feet, perhaps above the foot using dorsiflexion, below the foot using plantar flexion, or by the side of the foot. But these locations may require too big a movement for someone with muscle weakness. So it's something we certainly can explore. At the lower extremities, we can place a switch by the medial side of the knee, the inner knee. Usually movement laterally or lifting the leg is going to be too difficult for people with muscle weakness. But you know, a lot of children with spinal muscular atrophy maintain or sustain the ability to move at a finger, a thumb, sometimes both together, and also in hip adduction. And so we can take advantage of that and place a switch. So we saw this picture earlier of this young man on the left. He has SMA using a Microlight switch by his medial knee here, and it's a lightweight mechanical switch. And then to the right, we have Fareed, who also has spinal muscular atrophy. You can see that fiber optic switch by his left index finger, but then he also has two proximity switches by either leg, and he was able to bring his legs in, and he used these to drive his power wheelchair. So again, I would encourage you, I know that was really quick, looking at some potential switch sites for people with muscle weakness, but if you have some ideas for a client you work with, go ahead and jot those down, and we're going to answer some more of your great questions. So here we go. Jennifer said, someone once told me about a REED, R-E-E-D switch that he uses a lot as a wheelchair vendor. I have not heard of a REED switch, so I'm not familiar with that one. It'd be interesting to ask them what they mean by that. Maria has said, what switch have you found the best for muscle weakness? Well, what I hope by going through this content here today is that we can agree that this assessment process is really important. For that individual, we need to determine where do they have movement, how far can they move in that direction with how much force, and do they have enough endurance at that location to use that switch site with sustained pressure and or repeatedly. And once we determine that, we can match that to the best switch. So if that person can use a mechanical switch, great. If that's too difficult for them, if it requires too much force, then we downshift to electrical switches. If someone needs a very small target to capture extremely small movement, then probably we're looking more at fiber optics. If they can manage with a proximity, that might be a good option as well. And Jenny has asked, what was the black cushion switch called in the previous picture? Oh, I'd have to look back to where we were at that point. Black cushion switch. Let me think on that one. And Jennifer says, I have not been able to find this. Any ideas? Jennifer, are you referring to the REED switch? If that's what you haven't been able to find. And Lindsay has said, is there any way to add a bite switch onto the Joust 3 joystick? The sip and puff feature is hard for our kid. You know, I'm not aware of any bite switches that are available anymore. There used to be. There was one from Tash that was a bite switch, but it might be possible to make one or modify something else on the market, but I'm not available of any bite switches. If someone had one, it might be enabling devices. The question would be how much pressure is required. So if someone is using the, sorry, that question went away. The Joust, mouth joystick, and can't use the sip and puff, then it might be that close by to their body, they can use another switch. So for example, if they're having trouble with sip and puff, that ASL headset with the fiber optic switch, if that's aimed towards their cheek, they might be able to puff their cheek out and activate it, or use another part of their body to touch a light touch switch to be that click. So I hope that's helpful. And Jennifer said, yes, any idea of where to find the REED switch? You know, I don't know. Besides doing a Google switch, I don't know. I just haven't heard of that one before. And Deidre has asked any advice on securing a switch if it is used in bed aside from mounting. I'll try Velcro and non-slip material with mixed outcomes. Before I get to that, Deidre, I want to be sensitive to everyone's time because we literally have 1 more minute. So I'm going to quickly go through our case study, and then I'm happy to stay on for anyone who's able to and keep answering all these great questions because we have a lot of them. So real quick, this is Julian, and we've seen him in a few other pictures when he was younger. He's now 24 and he has type 1 spinal muscular atrophy. And his goal was to be able to access a switch for his speech generating device from wheelchair and bed. He used to use a power wheelchair. He does not anymore. It was becoming more difficult for him and he chose to stop. And so he's in his manual chair here. He's used switches since he was about 1 year old for playing. And he started using a power chair at about age 3 with a combination of mechanical and electrical switches. But over time, this became more and more difficult. And again, he spends a lot of time in bed. It was hard to keep his fingers aligned with a fiber optic switch. He was already using one by a thumb or finger over the years. We tried making a custom arm trough for him, but we are still having difficulty with alignment as he had had changes to his wrist, causing some deviation there. So this was a joint project where I went over to a hand clinic where someone smarter than me on splints could make him a really cool splint to keep his hand and particularly his finger in alignment with a fiber optic switch. And he can wear this in bed and in his manual wheelchair. And here you can see a video of him using a very small movement to activate this fiber optic switch. So he basically rests on top of it and moves away from it to activate it. Something that's unique on these fiber optic switches is most of them can be adjusted in a way so they're activated when you move away from them. That means the client doesn't have to hover over them, which takes more muscle strength. So to sum up, it's important when we're working with people who have muscle weakness to look at small activation travel, little or no activation force. We need to accommodate change if this person has a progressive condition and provide adequate postural support. In Julian's case, a splint. I'm going to get to those questions in just a moment, but I do want to thank you very much for your time and make sure you have my contact information. So for those of you who need to hop off, I totally understand. For those of you who are able to stay, I am happy to answer these questions. I'm just going to move these question boxes where I can see them. So, Jenny, I really hate to do this to you, but just in lack of time, I am not sure what the black cushion switch was in the picture because I'm not sure what slide that was. So I will, if I have time, go back and try to figure that one out. Deidre, you had mentioned securing a switch in bed aside from mounting. Now, the tricky part when someone's accessing from bed is that that person's position will often change while they're in bed. They might move, they might be moved from somebody else. And so the switch placement has to move. So I will typically use a mount. I'll get something like a universal switch mount, attach it to a bed rail or to the head of the bed, and try to allow caregivers to place that depending on the client's unique position at that given time in bed. So that's what I usually do. Oh, Jenny says it's on slide 43. Let me look really fast here. Thank you for looking back for me. Slide 43. Oh, black cushion switch. It looks like a cushion. Let me go back here. But it's not. This is actually a Microlight switch on the right picture. So thank you. That clears that up. All right. Lindsay has mentioned that there's a bite switch from Glass House. So great. Thank you. Thank you. That's right. I need to write that down. I forgot about that. I really haven't used that one. And someone else mentioned that as well. Thank you. Okay. Tracy also mentioned that. And Lindsay is using this for someone with a C1 injury. Great application. So several people have mentioned that option. Thank you. Charles, again, yes, there's a handout that has a PDF of this PowerPoint that you'll get if you haven't gotten it already. We'll get that to you. And Graham has said a reed switch is normally a small switch operated by a magnet. Well, I'll have to check into that because I am just not familiar with that option. Another challenge with funding is it's important that we work with manufacturers typically that suppliers can. Oh, and Carla sent an article about reed switches in the chat box. So thank you. I'll have to check that out. In order for us to get funding approval for a switch for a client, we need to be able to order, or the complex rehab supplier has to order from a manufacturer that can work with them. And so if it's something that doesn't offer that, that can be a challenge, like something we find just on the internet, for example. Maria said, where can we access the webinars about switch hierarchy? If you go to Ablenet University on YouTube, and if you want, you can search, just put in my last name and look through, and you'll see a course about switch assessment and how do we determine where to put the switch. All right, let me go to our chat box here and make sure I've answered everything there. Yes, okay, I think I'm caught up on questions. So if you have more questions or comments, feel free to type those in. And again, thanks to Graham and Carla for information about the reed switch. I'll have to check that out. And information on our byte switch from Glasshouse. All right, so I will wait a moment to see if anyone else has any questions or other comments. We always have great discussion on the Ablenet webinars. We do have a similar focused course that's available too on switch assessment for people with increased muscle tone that you might want to check out as well. Make sure I have my contact info again. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions or comments right now. So Jim, I'm going to go ahead and let you wrap us on it.
All right, thank you, Michelle, for another wonderful presentation, as many participants have already said. For those of you still with us, you will receive an email tomorrow to access the certificate of attendance. Thank you for attending and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.